Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight you find me in the tribunal, where tonight Maregrte Oakdens is going to give her talk from when she used to work in English Heritage and some of the spookier things that went on there. So I'm going to shut up now and I'm going to say over to Maregrte.
On behalf of Raspberry Town Council, welcome to the tribunal for this call tonight, which I have to say is for entertainment purposes only. I have to say that by law. So my name is Margaret. Some years ago I worked for English Heritage as the historic properties manager of the West Midlands. So I had a broad brush of properties ranging from Neolithic sites to Whitley Court in Worcestershire, which was the most, I suppose, the most modern of my sites. And that dated back to the early part of the 20th century. That was its heyday. But again, it was sitting on a medieval village, so again, loads and loads of layers of history there. So this talk I'm going to give tonight is one I gave to English Heritage members many years ago. English Heritage members, they had a special evening. But it became quite a popular talk really 3 years later. But it's about things that happened to me. And I have to say, right from the start, that I have never seen a ghost. I can pick up on energy and I can pick up on presences, but I've never physically ever seen a ghost. And I've never had a paranormal activity around me until I went to work at Kenilworth Castle. So my first day working at English Heritage was actually the 5th of November. And it was a really horrible day like today. And I walked across the castle tiltyard and I thought, what a dump this place is. I'm going to have to do something with this place. And I met all the staff. And then, as a test, one of them said to me, we've got a group of Americans here. Would you take them round on a tour? They want to understand the medieval defences of Kenilworth Castle. Now this was a trick because people thought that I came from a retail background and I didn't know anything about history. But they didn't know that actually I've got a degree in medieval history and I knew a lot about Kenilworth long before I ever came there. So I took the tour around and afterwards we had a chat. And one of the ladies came up to me and she said, I'm psychic, you know. Now when you hear that on a site, your heart just plummets to your knees because you never know what's going on next. So I said, oh, that's really interesting. And she said, you sound as though you've lived here all your life. And I said, no, it's a ruin. Nobody lives here. My office is in the gatehouse, and that dates back to 1649. And that's the most modern part of the building, with a roof on. And she said, well, you know, the castle likes you. And I said, the castle is sticks and stones. And she said, no. There's a spirit here, and it likes you. And you'll always be happy here. So that was quite comforting because I wasn't welcomed by anybody else, but quite nice to have a spirit around. And we never thought any more of it. And my head custodian, Bob, who was a very lovely man and very friendly, said to me, at least you've got one fan. But that was on the Friday. And the Monday morning, I got a big ambitious plan for Kenilworth. I was going to put opera on, I was going to do evening theatre. And we had two groups coming to visit us. One was Opera Box, which was a professional opera company. The other was a local amateur dramatic society who wanted to put on Canterbury Tales. So the best time for them to come was when there was no visitors at the site. So on Mondays, in those days, English Heritage closed the sites on Monday. So Bob came to help me out. And I went and said to him, right, I'm going to take the amateurs, because they're always more trouble, and you can take the professionals, and let's just sort them both out. So we did. We spent all morning walking around the castle and getting lots of information, where people wanted things, etc. And everything went smoothly. And we went back to the Queen of Castle, a pub which is conveniently outside Kenilworth, and the castle itself, and had a drink. It was such a cold day. That gave me the opportunity to talk to Opera Box, who I hadn't had a chance to speak to before, to introduce myself. So I spoke to a lady called Bridget, and she said, this castle is fantastic. I said, yeah, it is. It lends itself to theatre. Kenilworth lends itself to theatre. It's just got that atmosphere. And she said, I didn't realise that your custodians wore outfits, Margaret. And I said, oh yeah, we wear outfits. I said, I've got mine on today. And she went, no, outfits. I said, what do you mean, outfits? She said, oh, you were walking around with the Amateur Dramatic Society, weren't you? And I said, yes, I was. And she said, well, one of them's in costume. Fancy coming up in costume on a day like today? So I didn't know what to say to her. I said, what did he look like? She said he'd got long dark hair and he'd got a sort of dark red doublet on with long sleeves, and he'd got high boots, and he'd got a hat on that came down on one side. She said, you must have seen him. He was walking, he was next to you. He said he had his arms around your shoulder. You must know who I'm talking about. Well, I didn't. So I didn't know what to say to her. So I said, oh, him. Well, that was quite a puzzle, because Bob said to me, did you feel anything? I said, no, I didn't see anything, didn't feel anything, didn't feel any arm around my shoulder, anything like that. But she was absolutely adamant. And we just shrugged it off. And around about a week later, on a Sunday, Bob and I were in the gatehouse. And none of the staff would come in the gatehouse on a Sunday because it's too cold, and they'd all got their own little cottages and little villagey things behind their ticket offices. So they get teas and coffees. They didn't need to come in. So I'm there and I'm upstairs, and I heard Bob go for his lunch. Bob's office was downstairs and mine was upstairs. So I ran down the stairs and said to him, Bob, I need some coffee. Because Bob and I had a guilty secret. We liked good coffee, so we hid it from the staff. And it was hidden in Bob's office. So off I go, get the coffee. And he said, here, have the keys. He said, and I'll give them me back when I come back. So I watched him walk out. And I spooned the coffee grounds into the cafetiere. And I said out loud, I should have put the kettle on, because the kettle boiled, took ages to boil. So I locked Bob's office up, walked out, walked into the kitchen, and the kettle just clicked off. And I looked at it, and now I'd seen him go out the office. I never could. So I looked around, couldn't see anybody, so I went and touched the kettle, and it was hot. So I poured the water into the coffee grounds and said, thank you very much, we brought it upstairs, and went and left it. And when Bob came back, gave me his keys, and I said, Bob, did you put the kettle on for me? And he said, no. He said, I thought about it when I went out. I said, well, did you have a coffee? He said, no, I haven't had a drink all morning. So at that point, I told him what had happened. And from that time onward, we called this entity, whatever it was, Richard. It came into our heads to call him Richard. Bob called him Dick. He was less sensitive than me. And it got to silly proportions where I'd go in the morning and I'd say, good morning, Richard. Or I'm not going to be here tomorrow, Richard. I'm going to Kirby Luxlow, whatever. And it was just, we just knew somebody was there. Because my desk would have things moved on it. Not lost, just moved around. And one day I was in the garden early talking to the gardener, and I looked up and it was a hot sunny day, and my windows of my office opened, and I thought, oh, that's kind of Bob, he's opened the windows, but Bob wasn't there. Bob was Bob's day off. So I tore upstairs, looked around, nobody in the gatehouse, only me. So Richard and I became more or less jogging along friends, and I used to talk to him and say to him, tell him what was going on. It's almost like the bees, you tell the bees what to do or what's going on. It was almost like I told Richard what was going on. And so did Bob, both of us. He became almost an entity. And then one day I was in my office planning a big event, a big Civil War event, which meant horses, cannons, a lot. And it takes a great deal of planning to keep people safe. And I really didn't want a reenactor sitting in front of me telling me his life story. And he would not go. He would not leave. I did everything I could to make him leave. I stood up I walked to the door, I opened the door, and he still sat there. And then, suddenly, he dashed past me, down the stairs, and I said to him, "Oh, are you all right?" He went, "I'm not coming in there again, there's something in there, there's something dreadful in there. It's just thrown me out." And I came back and I went, "Thanks." So but we jumped along, Richard and I, quite well, until I had to leave the castle. And then Richard had a dark side. And because I'm pretty thick and I'm not psychic, I didn't cotton on what was happening. But in English Heritage, you're on what is called a mobile grade, which means you have to go anywhere, you don't have a choice. And so we had a big problem in Shropshire with an area manager who left, and they wanted me to go in and sort Shropshire out, which meant I couldn't go to Kenilworth every day. So I wasn't happy because it meant a round trip of 100 miles a day. I've got a huge site to look after. So I couldn't look after Kenilworth as well. So I buzzed in one of my friends from Kirby Hall to look after the castle while I was temporarily missing. But didn't realise that everybody would be upset. All my custodians were upset. I was upset because I didn't want to work so far away, but I had no choice. And then one day Bob came into the office and he said to me, "Have you seen the accident book recently?" And I said, "No, I haven't looked at it yet." He went, "Well, I think you ought to." So we opened it, looked at it. I said, "Well, what's happening?" He said, "All these kids are falling off Henry's Mound." Now, Henry's Mound was a mound built in the Civil War. It's called Henry's Mound because it was by Henry V's gate. And they used to put cannons on it to fire over the water. Because Kenilworth didn't have a moat. It had a lake that was a quarter of a mile wide all around it, all around 3/4 of it. So it was an impregnable castle. So with that, we went up, we checked the handrail, we checked erosion, and I said to him, "Look, I can't see anything at all, Bob." I said, "So just tell the teachers to keep the kids away from it." So then the gardener came and said to me, "Margaret, do you mind if I work off site today?" And I said, "No, of course I don't. Where do you want to go?" And he went, "I'll go over to Kirby Hooks and look at the water lilies." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Why?" He went, "I can't bear the garden. I can't bear being in the garden." He said, "I'm so angry in the garden. I want to punch people." He said, "I've just got to get out of the garden." And I still didn't sort of take any notice of this. Took no notice at all until I actually saw it for myself. I'd actually saw it for myself. And I was actually just before I left, we were with a group of people planning a fireworks display. The castle was open to other people the display on. So we went out and we were talking, and I happened to look up at Henry's Mound, and I saw somebody standing there. And it was a visitor, and he was taking photographs over the lake. So I looked at it, and then I looked again, and I saw her come off the top of it, like that. She didn't touch the sides. She didn't touch the sides. She just came straight up. She fell at least 12 foot. She landed with a thud, the camera was smashed. So we all rushed over to her, tried to pick her up, see if she was all right. She just scrambled to her feet and said, "I'm all right, just got to go. And I said to her, "No, you must sit down, you've had a terrible shock, And no, I must go." So she headed out, so I couldn't follow her because I was with the council. So I radioed over to the ticket office and said, "The lady coming out, she'd just come off the top of Henry's Mound. And we just try and get her to sit down and see if she's okay." But she just went and wouldn't stay, which was, and then I thought to myself, this is Richard. He's not very happy. So what am I going to do with this? I can't tell him to be people off the top of Henry's Mound. So I went until the castle was closed and there was nobody in the castle. Locked up, walked up and stood on the top of Henry's Mound. And I'm so used to speaking to Richard that I spoke to him and I just said, "Look, I'm sorry, I have to go. This is nothing to do with me. I do not have a choice in this matter. I have to go.
It's got something happening here, so if we move up the road a bit, it will be nice.
Cannot keep throwing people off Henry's land. You never can do it. I'm really sorry, but you have to go. You have to go with it. I don't have any choice. So with that, I said, if you're that cross, you can chuck me off Henry's land now, waiting for you. And I stood on top of the mound, and nothing happened. So I just felt pretty stupid, and I went home. But from the day I left Kenilworth, nothing worked. Kenilworth was in a really bad state till I got back about a year later, and I could sort it out again. So I don't know, but Richard had almost become a personal friend, and I got used to talking to him. And I suppose that stood me in good stead for the angry cavalier at Boscobel House, who was one of my next encounters. To try and explain to you, Boscobel House is just a house that stands alone. It's called a house, but it's never been lived in. It's actually, what it is a hunting lodge. And it was once completely surrounded by a dense forest. And it's been made famous because the oak tree, the royal oak, is where King Charles II hid after the Battle of Worcester. Because the secret at Boscobel House is that it's a priest's house. Because it was a hunting lodge and it belonged to the Gifford family, who were gentry, when the dissolution of the monastery started, they were a Catholic family and they were not prepared to give up their faith, but they weren't prepared to talk about it either, because you risk losing your life if you did. And so what they did is they turned this into a safe house, so people could go and hear mass. There was 2 priest holes in there, one which was an escape route, and one which wasn't meant to be found. So that's the history, and that was how the Cavalier came to be there. There's a lot of history to Boscobel. But the other useful thing in Boscobel was that the people who were brought in as gamekeepers were actually Jesuits, and they were called the Pendrell family. And the Pendrells were skilled at getting priests into the country and priests out of the country. And so that was the right place to bring the future King Charles II, because they knew that if anybody could get him out of the country after the Battle of Worcester, the Pendrell brothers could. So it's actually haunted by a cavalier. We have no idea who he is. We don't know who he is. He's no name, he's just there. And he's really bad-tempered. He doesn't sort of manifest himself, although he's been seen a couple of times by the banister. One of my custodians came out after closing the place down and got rather a thoughtful look on his face. And I said to him, "Are you all right, Tony?" He went, "Oh yeah," I said, "I think I've just seen a ghost." So I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I've just seen that cavalier who's standing at the bottom of the stairs." He said, "I looked and he'd gone." So I thought, oh no, that's what cavaliers do, especially if it goes and they disappear. But this one kicks the fuss up. He's an absolute pain in the backside. Because every year we have to clean Boscobel House. It has to have what is called a conservation clean. And that means the whole place has to shut down. And everything, literally everything, has to be clean. Floorboards come up, everything has to be clean. And he doesn't like it. So he kicks up the most terrible fuss. He bangs and clatters and kicks things over and things disappear. He makes a noise at night. He turns the intruder alarms on and off, which annoys the head custodian, because the head custodian actually lives on site, not in the house itself. Boscobel House has never been lived in, but the back of it is a Victorian farmyard, and that's where the custodian and his family lived. But all the alarms are are actually in the annex, which is my Boscobel House, and it has to be alarmed because of the value of the artefacts that are in it. So every time the alarm goes off, Peter has to come out and reset it. And this cavalier does it at least 3 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock in the morning. It's a nightmare. But one year, this particular year, he excelled himself because we had to have what is called a fumigation of all the Tudor timberwork to prevent woodworm getting in it. It's done every 10 years and it's really awful because people go in masks and fumigate everything. Well, it sent him into the stratosphere. He bumped and banged and clattered about the place. Peter's keys went missing, were found in the privet hedge outside. He was just a nuisance. And I was starting to get really quite concerned because the staff were becoming frightened of him. And so, but one particular night I was sitting at home watching television with my husband. It was about 10:15, and my phone went. It's Peter, a head custodian. And I can tell by his voice something's wrong. So I said to him, "Are you okay?" And he said, I'm standing in the lane." I said, and of course I thought the house is ablaze, you know, first thing you think of. And I said to him, "What's happened?" And he said, "I can't go back in there, Margaret." He said, "He's at it again." He said, "He started at 10 o'clock. Started at 10 o'clock this morning. The fire alarm's been going off, on and up all day." He said, "It's just gone off. I've gone in and I've reset it." He said, "I've turned my back and it's gone again." He said, "And I've turned to watch it. And it's just like somebody walking down stair by stair, tripping all the passives on the way down. And when it gets to the door, the annex door, which is locked between the house itself and where the custodians have to wait to do the tours," he said the door started to bang. So loud that it shook. The door was shaking. He said if it hadn't been locked, it would have burst open. He said, "I just ran out. I couldn't bear it. I just ran out." So I said, "Look, why don't you just go down and just phone the security company, get them to come out with you and lock the place up." And he said, "Yeah, I will do." And I said, "Look, I'll come out, but it will take me an hour to get to you." It's my husband going. That's my custodian. So I said, but he said, no, I'll go in. And he did. And he did the bravest thing I certainly would have done it. He actually unlocked the door, went in the house, on the off chance he'd actually left somebody in, locked somebody in, although it wasn't open to the public, so it would have been, I've no idea. So I came back and I could see that the staff were getting more and more frightened, and I didn't know what to do. But I did know of a man called Eddie Burke, who has long since died, I'm afraid. But Eddie Burke would move spirits on, and I was very tempted to start talking to him to get him up to Boscobel. So I went in one day, and the racket in there was absolutely terrible. They had an exhibition, and it sounded like the entire exhibition was being wrecked. It just sounded like mayhem was going on this floor, and the staff were all at the bottom of the stairs looking up. So I go in, and the racket is still going on. So I said, "Look, what's going on?" So I pushed them out of the way, and I ran upstairs. The minute I got to the top of the stairs, it stopped. And I walked in, and there was nothing out of place, absolutely nothing. It was completely as though nothing, well, it was just perfect. And yet, if you'd have been downstairs, you'd have thought the place would have been decimated. So I thought, well, I've spoken to Richard, I'll have a go with this one. And I said to him, I've had enough of this. If you don't stop this, I am going to get somebody to move you on, and I'll meet you. I am sick and tired of this. No answer, nothing. But he got his own back on me, because the next day I was giving a guided tour around the house to give Peter the birth. And this hand came round my ankle, like this. I was on the stairs, and I couldn't move. And I couldn't move for at least 2 minutes. And I was talking to these people, and I'm rabbiting on, because they don't know somebody's hanging on to my ankle. And they just think I'm just talking for talking's sake, and I couldn't get him off my ankle. Eventually, he let go. And I went downstairs, and everything was smooth. Went outside, and I said to Pete, he's grabbed my ankle on the stairs. And he said, "Where?" And I had marks on my ankle that lasted at least 2 hours. Just a big red mark, as if somebody grabbed my ankle like this. He didn't pull me, just grabbed me. So I think that was his last call with me. But for all I know, he's still there. And he's still doing exactly what he's been doing for the past few hundred years, making a horrible noise if anything upsets him, and he doesn't like any. Sometimes he doesn't like people around the house and pushes them out of the way. He's shouldered Peter out of the way a couple of times, but he never did that to me, just grabbed my ankle. So, and just at Boscobel House, just down the road from Boscobel House, is another building which is called White Ladies Priory. And again, that's part of the Gifford family estate. There were a group of nuns there who were canonesses, really, Augustinian canonesses. And they were there to pray for the family. And of course, when the dissolution came, they had to move. Now, a lot of these nuns, there was probably only about 6 of them. It was a very small sort of enclave. They decided that the Gifford family decided that they would protect them. So they just kept them in the family. They just kept them. And so I think they paid the abbess off £5, which was a vast sum of money in those days. But then they just looked after the elderly nuns and just absorbed them into their family. But that was where the Pendrell brothers lived, and obviously over time the place fell into disrepair. So that all that stands there now is just the bare bones of what was the nunnery and the church. It stands in a field about 1/8 of a mile from Boscobel House itself, and it was the bane of my life because it was a prime target for devil worshippers who would come out and light bonfires and put bits of animal all around the place. It was a nightmare. Boscobel House is literally in the depths of the country, and the nearest big city is Wolverhampton. There's no chance that anybody, a policeman coming out, would even see the place, never mind be able to do anything about it. So it was just a nuisance to us all. So when this group of scouts turned up and wanted to camp there for some sort of tests that they were doing, initially I said no, because I was worried that they would have a visitor at night and they were all young kids. So they kept phoning me up and they said, look, there'll be adults there. So I told them about it. I said, look, it's no point calling for help because it's not going to come. I said, the nearest point of help is the custodian. No, we'll be all right. It's only a small group of people and we've got 2 adults and 2 men that will be there. So I said, okay. So they turned up, but the men were only about 18. They weren't what I call sort of mature people. But for the first night they were fine and no trouble at all. The second night, 2 o'clock in the morning, there's banging on the door of Peter's house. And he goes to open the door and finds all the scouts standing there in their pyjamas. So he thought immediately they'd been attacked and there'd been some youths that had come over and tried to vandalise the place. And so they gathered them all in the house and kept them safe, put them up for the night. And Peter said, don't tell me, just go to bed. We'll sort it out in the morning. So in the morning he went down with the 2 young men and all the tents were in perfect order, just as they'd left them. And he said, what happened? And he said, well, we heard this singing. He said, we heard music. He said, then I heard this singing. And I said, I shouted to the boys, turn that radio off. Not supposed to be, keep the music down. And they shouted back, we're not singing. So he said, I thought what you told me, we've got vandals, they're going to, he said, we put our tracky bottoms on and we got out and there was nobody there, but we could still hear this music. And by this time, the other kids had come out of the tent and were standing there as well. He said, and then a group of nuns appeared. He said, and they just walked past us. And we couldn't breathe. We couldn't move. He said it was though we were completely paralysed. He said, and we watched them walk past, he said, and they were like real people. They weren't wispy or transparent. They were like real people. And they had these big, wide, winged headdresses on. He said, and we just couldn't move until as the last monk went past, she grabbed my arm and said, why don't you leave us alone? And that was it. They ran for Boscobel House. When Peter told me the next morning, I actually said to him, well, I wish they'd appear when the vandals are there and frighten the living daylights out of them because, scaring kids is easy. So that again, we have a lot of paranormal activity around monasteries in Shropshire, which is the most pagan county with the most monasteries and abbeys in it. And the nearest abbey, I suppose, is Buildwas Abbey. And Buildwas Abbey is a Cistercian abbey, not too far away from Ironbridge itself. And the Iron Bridge itself was my responsibility. But the town of Ironbridge has grown up round Buildwas Abbey.
which is very plain. The Cistercians were very plain, sort of austere group of monks. So there weren't very many rich pickings for Cromwell's people and the dissolution of the monastery. They just took the lead off the roof. So that means quite a lot of Buildworth still stands. And there's a nice chapter house with beautiful medieval tiles there. Well, Buildworth, I should say, is on a bend. It's off the road, but the road curves round and it's quite dangerous. And so people visiting the Abbey would park on the verge of the road. And it was too dangerous. So we decided we were going to put a car park in. So we put a car park, spaced it all out, and I left them. And the next time I was in Roxton the next day, I have a panic phone call from the head custodian. Come quick, we've dug a monk up. So I said, how? Oh, well, the digger, he's gone the wrong side of all the stakes we put in, and he's gone into the monk cemetery. In goes a shovel, up comes a monk. So off I go down there. Now, makes life awkward because you have to call out an inspector because the inspector has to verify that the bones are indeed old. If they're not, you have to get the coroner and all sorts of things get involved. Well, the nearest guy that I could contact was my friend Glyn, and he was in the north of England. It took him 4 hours to get to me. So in the meantime, we gave the digger driver a cup of coffee and calmed him down. And I said to him, you can't go. You're not allowed to go because we've got to bury him. And we can't do it. And you've dug him up and it's your fault. So we sent him down the pub for a bit, for a meal. And then eventually Glyn turns up and says, oh yeah, well, they are medieval. Something we all knew anyway, but has to be verified. And then he said, shall we put him back together again? I said, well, I think we ought to because he's all over the place. So we basically put the skeletal remains back into what was a body, what we thought was a body, looking out for little things like finger bones and things like that. And in the meantime, all the staff had gone round the hedges and gathered wildflowers. And they put all wildflowers round the bones. And they made a cross. And they gave him a cross. And Glyn said a few words in Latin over him. And we buried him. And we thought that was the end of it. Until the next day, when the head custodian phoned me up again. And she said, something's happened. And I said, don't tell me you've dug another one up. And she said, no, I haven't dug another one up. But the strangest thing happened today. The farmer came down in a fit and a fury, shouting the odds on. What the hell are you people doing? And she said, we're just having a car park put in. You know, it's on our land. It shouldn't cause a problem. He said, I'm not talking about the car park. He said, I'm talking about that idiot who was standing on the road there yesterday. He said, dressed up as a monk. He said he was wandering all up and down the road. He said, I nearly hit him. He got a mouthful for me. He said, I can tell you. Standing on the side of the road, making a fool of everybody. He said, you people ought to be shot, you know, whatever. Then she said to me, do you think it's him? And I said, I think we've buried him. I wouldn't worry too much about it. But in the meantime, who knows? So when I phoned Glyn, he said, well, he said, you know what, Margaret, he said, poor little devil, he's been lying there for 600 years. Some idiot comes and digs him up. He doesn't know what a motorcycle is, does he? Doesn't know what a tractor is. He's a bit curious. He's gone to have a look. Yeah. So, but we didn't hear any more from that particular little spirit. And just down the road again from there is Lillishall Abbey. Lillishall is quite close to a very famous sports area. But it's a beautiful site. It's an Augustinian site. It was the scene of a murder. The abbot was murdered there. And here I have to say, I know this hasn't happened to me. I'm only hearing this hearsay from one of my custodians. But apparently there's a monk who appears and says to people, do you know the secret? Nobody knows the secret. And he's quite solid. He's in a black Augustinian gown. And he wanders around there, asking this question. He hasn't been seen lately, so I think he's probably fading a bit. But we don't know who he is. But all we know is an abbot was murdered there by another monk called Toby somebody or other, who actually got away with it. Because in medieval times, if you were a monk, you committed an offence, you got tried by the church itself. you didn't get tried in a court of law. And that was the basis of the argument between Thomas Becket and Henry II, because a monk had killed somebody and Henry II said he ought to be tried in a court because he's committed a murder. Becket disagreed, and that was the basis of their big argument. So there was quite two splits within, you know, the clergy and the laity. So Lilleshall Abbey does have its ghost. I've never seen him there. Ormond Abbey, we've seen people in, as one little boy said, in dressing gowns. What are those men in dressing gowns doing, walking around? Or they were walking around the cloister. And here, Ormond has quite. It was rather a big site, and it was a very rich site. And we found out when we did a lot of excavation there that it was actually a proper hospital. And we found bones of children in the graveyards. We found bones of women. We found bones of disabled people who had lived a long time. The bones of one disabled person were at least 40 years old, which was old by medieval standards anyway. But it proved that he'd been cared for, he'd been looked after. And that was the problem with the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry VIII wiped out the social services of medieval times, and not till the Poor Laws of Elizabeth I do we get people being responsible for people who needed help. So Ormond is interesting because the people there were skilled doctors, and they helped a man called John Bradbury, who extracted an arrow from the face of Prince Henry, the future King Henry V. Who got an arrow in his face in the Battle of Shrewsbury. And they pulled the shaft out, but they couldn't get the barb out, and it was buried in his face, 6 inches into his face. And so they had to invent a pair of scissors to get it out. And for 5 days, that barb was in Henry's face. So how he didn't die of septicemia, I do not know. But that's why you only ever see a portrait of Henry V in profile. You never see him full-faced, because half his face was destroyed. And it was the monks of Ormond Abbey that went out to look after him, and he was then transferred to Kenilworth Castle, and the guy came down from London to do the operation. So that's Ormond Abbey's claim to fame, as well as the fact that it's got medieval monks wandering around. Arthur's Stone, one of my sites which is on the border of Wales and Hereford, is a Neolithic site, a burial chamber actually. And for a long time there's been a story of a man on horseback that rides around it. I haven't seen him, local people have, but every Christmas a Romney gypsy used to overwinter there just for a few days. And I can guarantee you that every Christmas morning some person would phone me up and say, "Do you know you've got a gypsy?" I used to say yes, but this one particular winter was quite hard, and gypsies are very proud people. So, and I was worried about him. So I took some milk and bread and bits and pieces up in the car with me, and went up and borrowed Martin's Land Rover and went up, and sure enough, there he was. And I said to him, would you do me a favour? I said, somebody's given me ever such a lot of food. I don't suppose you'd give it to the birds or something, would you? And he said, oh yeah, all right then. So I gave him all the food that I'd sort of got from home, and I felt a lot better now he got some food that and warmth that he could have and keep him going. And we were sitting over the campfire, he made me a cup of tea, and he said, I saw him last night, you know. So I said, who? And he went, the chap who rides by on a horse. So I said, really? And he went, yeah. He said he rides by. He said, he doesn't look at me. He said, he just rides by. I said, well, what does he look like then? And he said, well, he hasn't got a saddle or a bridle on the horse. And it's not a horse, it's a pony. He said, because his feet are nearly on the floor. He said, but he goes at a lick path. And I believe that's what he saw. Now, I can't verify that, because I can verify Richard and I can verify the Cavalier and all the others, but I can't verify that because I've not seen him myself. But I do believe that is what he genuinely saw. And again, you know, we've got Whitley Court, a vast Victorian mansion that is a ruin now. but it has its few ghosts. It has a gamekeeper who walks up and down. One of my custodians went running after him because he'd got a gun, and he thought that, you can't have a gun with visitors. And when he went after him, he suddenly just disappeared in front of him. Again, I didn't see it, but I do believe my custodian did, because he was quite shaken. And so those are some of the stories that I'm able to tell you tonight. They are all true. They all happened to me. And many people ask me, what are ghosts? And the answer is, I don't really know. I think that I don't like to call them ghosts. I prefer to call them spirits. But I think there's three sorts, or at least three main sorts. One is what I call a crisis apparition. Something that appears at a moment of extreme peril or extreme death. A lot of that was noted in the First World War and the Second World War, where apparitions would appear at that moment of either death or real trouble. You didn't have to die to appear. Some people appeared, but were alive. And I call that a crisis apparition. And then there's the other sort that come back with a reason. They've got unfinished business and they need to try and solve it or sort it out. And then there's what I call those on a loop, which is just a memory that goes round and round and round. And in the first sort of memory that I suppose you could say would be Catherine Howard, who runs screaming through the gallery at Hampton Court. Well, she's fading after a bit. At one time you could see her, but now you just hear her. And that sort of thing is, I believe, if you're in the right place at the right time, you will see something, if you're lucky enough to see it. So let me give you an illustration. I once knew an exorcist called Father Dominic. And Father Dominic and I used to have long conversations about spirits. And I asked him one day if he'd ever seen a ghost. And he said, yeah, just once. I've only seen one. And it happened at a house that had suddenly developed poltergeist activity. Nothing had happened before or since, but this poltergeist activity started. Things being thrown around, the usual poltergeist activity. But the people who owned the house hadn't called the church in. They called a medium in. And the medium said, it's your gran, and she's furious because she wanted to be buried and you've promoted her. And what's more, she didn't have a service either. So this was a Catholic family. Father Dominic, of course, is a Catholic. So Father Dominic was sent to talk to the people. And they said, well, we can't do anything about it now. She's been cremated. What can we do? And he said, well, the only thing I can suggest is that let's hold a mass. He said, have you got the ashes in the house? And they said, yes. And he said, well, I suggest you bury them after this. Don't keep human remains in a house. But if you're agreeable, we'll have a mass and we'll have the ashes here. And that's what they did. He said, and as I was finishing the mass, I looked up and out the corner of my eye, I saw this lady standing there, this elderly lady standing there with a great big smile on her face. And then she disappeared. He said, and I knew that would be the end. So that's my example of a ghost that comes back for a reason. Unfinished business. The second was quite interesting because this happened in Nottingham. And Father Dominic was called in to the family in Nottingham who were experiencing the weirdest things. They just moved into a council house on a modern estate, and they woke up one morning, the second night they were there, they woke up with noises on the landing. And so they opened the door and they saw shadow people carrying what they said were brown paper parcels up and down the landing. So they fled the house, called the police. Police arrived. They sent some poor constable up there, young constable up there. And he came back and said, yes, there are people carrying brown paper parcels up and down the landing. So, cue Father Dominic. Before he does anything, he explained to me that he goes absolutely in-depth history about the site. And he found out that this site that was once a village, a medieval village, long, long since disappeared. And where this this house, this row of houses had been built, was the road past the church, their little church, into the burial ground. He further went back into history and he found that this particular village had been hit quite badly with bubonic plague, and literally 3/4 of the village had died. And so the little graveyard couldn't contain all the bodies, so they divided it into two. Adults went into one side, children into the other, in mass graves. And then he went back to the family and he said to them, why do have you ever experienced anything like this before? And they said, no. The people that lived here before never saw anything. It's a new house, it's less than 5 years old. We don't understand why. And he said, well, why have you moved here? And they said, oh, it was to get away from memories. We had bad memories at the other place that we lived. We had a cot death. And he suddenly realised that was the trigger for what was happening on the landing, because these people weren't carrying brown paper parcels. They were carrying their children to be buried in bubonic plague. And the trigger was the death of their child, and the grief and the place and the time had manifested this loop, which was just like a film being played. And that's another form of what I believe people call a haunting. So I'm coming to the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to ask me any questions about any of the sites or anything else, I'm quite happy to answer them if I can.
So, well then, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed Margaret's talk. I found it fascinating. All that stuff about the arrow in the head was quite amazing as well.
About Henry, yes.
Yeah.
Young Henry was 15 years old, fighting in the Battle of Shrewsbury, put his visor up and somebody took advantage and shot him in the face with an arrow.
There's always one, isn't there? There was always one. That went really well, I thought. Did you enjoy that?
I enjoyed talking about history. I enjoyed
listening to you talking about history, which leads me on to something. Margaret is an expert, having worked in English heritage on historical buildings, and particularly the one which stood in the tribunal. I know a lot of you out there don't really know much about it. So Margaret, at some point in the not very distant future, is going to show us around and just show us what a gem we have here.
Well, it is a gem, and I think I said before, this is a building that needs to tell its story.
Yes.
And its story is Glastonbury.
Yeah.
And the story of Glastonbury isn't just the festival, it's the actual story of the people.
No.
And this is the perfect place to tell it.
In the scale of things, the festival is just a hiccup in the last couple of seconds, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes, in the great pattern of history. Yeah.
Anyway, Margaret, thank you very much.
Thank you.